My mom begged me not to marry him. I didn't listen. 3 months later, I found out that he used to be her husband too. My name's Clarissa, I'm 34 years old, and this is my story. The rain hammered against the chapel windows like an omen I should have heeded. Standing at the altar in my grandmother's vintage lace dress, I watched Garrett's face light up as I walked down the aisle, his smile so radiant it could have powered the entire ceremony. My mother, Helena, sat rigid in the front pew, her knuckles white as she gripped her purse, tears streaming down her cheeks in a way that seemed more desperate than joyful. I had dismissed her concerns as typical maternal overprotectiveness, the natural anxiety of a mother watching her only daughter marry a man she barely knew. How catastrophically wrong I was. The warning signs had been there from the beginning, scattered like breadcrumbs leading to a truth so devastating it would shatter everything I thought I knew about my family. Helena's reaction when I first brought Garrett home for dinner 6 months earlier should have been my first clue. She had dropped the serving bowl, ceramic shards scattering across the kitchen floor like fragments of a broken mirror, her face draining of all color as she stared at him with an expression I couldn't quite decipher. "Where did you meet him?" she had whispered, her voice trembling with something that went far beyond surprise. But what mother doesn't worry about her daughter's choice in men? Garrett had been everything I thought I wanted in a husband: charming, successful, devastatingly handsome, with those piercing blue eyes and that crooked smile that made my heart skip beats. He was a real estate developer who drove a sleek black Mercedes and wore expensive suits that hugged his athletic frame perfectly. When he proposed on the rooftop of the city's most exclusive restaurant, with the skyline glittering behind us and a 2-carat diamond catching the moonlight, I felt like the luckiest woman alive. The way he looked at me that night, with such intensity and devotion, made me believe in fairy tales again. Yet something in my mother's eyes that evening suggested she knew a different version of this fairy tale entirely. The months leading up to our wedding had been a whirlwind of dress fittings, venue selections, and heated arguments with Helena about everything from the guest list to the choice of flowers. She had been unusually involved, almost obsessively so, questioning every detail about Garrett's background with a persistence that bordered on interrogation. "Tell me about his family again," she would say during our weekly planning lunches, her fingers nervously twisting her wedding ring, a habit I'd noticed increasing dramatically since Garrett entered our lives. Where exactly did he grow up? What about his previous relationships? I had attributed her invasive questions to empty nest syndrome and an overprotective streak that had intensified since my father's death 5 years earlier. Our honeymoon in Tuscany was everything I had dreamed it would be: romantic dinners overlooking rolling vineyards, long walks through medieval villages, and passionate nights in our villa with its ancient stone walls and views of cypress trees swaying in the Mediterranean breeze. Garrett was attentive and loving, surprising me with little gifts and handwritten notes that made me fall deeper in love with each passing day. We talked about our future with the excitement of newlyweds planning their perfect life together: the house we would buy, the children we would have, the adventures we would share. But even in paradise, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was lurking beneath the surface of our happiness. It started with small things that individually meant nothing, but collectively formed a pattern that would eventually lead me to the truth. Garrett's phone would buzz at odd hours, and he would excuse himself to take calls in private, his voice dropping to a whisper when he thought I couldn't hear. He seemed remarkably familiar with our city despite claiming to have moved there just 2 years ago, knowing shortcuts and hidden restaurants that even longtime residents might not discover. Most puzzling of all, he had an uncanny knowledge of my mother's habits and preferences, remembering details about her that I had never shared with him. When I mentioned these observations to him during our last night in Tuscany, Garrett's response was swift and convincing, his explanations so logical that I felt foolish for even bringing them up. "Business calls don't keep regular hours, sweetheart," he had said, pulling me close as we watched the sunset paint the sky in shades of amber and rose. "And I've always been good with directions. It's part of being in real estate. As for your mother, I pay attention because she's important to you. I want her to like me." His words were accompanied by that irresistible smile and a kiss that made me forget my concerns entirely. That night, as we made love under the Tuscan stars, I pushed aside my doubts and chose to believe in the fairy tale. But fairy tales, I would soon learn, have a way of revealing their darker origins when you dig deep enough. Our first month of marriage back home was blissful in its routine normalcy. Garrett would leave early for work, kissing me goodbye while I was still half asleep, and return in the evenings with flowers or my favorite takeout from the Thai restaurant down the street. We spent weekends exploring farmers markets, decorating our new apartment, and hosting dinner parties for friends who all seemed genuinely happy for us. Helena had begun to warm up to Garrett, or so I thought, joining us for Sunday dinners where she would sit quietly, watching him with an expression I mistook for grudging acceptance. Looking back now, I realized she was studying him like a scientist observing a dangerous specimen. The unraveling began on a Tuesday morning in early October, 3 months and 4 days after our wedding. I had taken the day off work to surprise Garrett with lunch at his office, stopping first at our favorite deli to pick up those Italian sandwiches he loved. The autumn air was crisp and filled with the scent of burning leaves, and I felt that particular kind of contentment that comes from being newly married and optimistic about the future. I had even bought a bottle of champagne to celebrate some good news I was planning to share with him, news that would make this surprise lunch even more special. But when I arrived at the sleek downtown building that housed his real estate firm, the receptionist's confused expression was my first indication that something was terribly wrong. "I'm sorry, but we don't have anyone by that name working here," the young woman said, checking her computer screen with a frown that deepened as she scrolled through what I assumed was an employee directory. "Are you sure you have the right company? Garrett Morrison, you said?" The way she repeated his name, with such genuine puzzlement, made my stomach drop. I had been to this office before, met his colleagues, attended the company holiday party just 8 months earlier where Garrett had introduced me as his fiancée to dozens of people who all seemed to know him well. Yet here I stood, clutching a bag of sandwiches and a bottle of champagne, being told that my husband of 3 months didn't exist. The elevator ride down to the lobby felt like a descent into an alternate reality where nothing made sense, and everything I thought I knew was suddenly questionable. My hands shook as I called Garrett's cell phone, listening to it ring endlessly before going to voicemail. His cheerful recorded message, "Hi, you've reached Garrett Morrison. Leave a message and I'll get right back to you," suddenly sounded foreign and suspicious, like a performance rather than a genuine greeting. I tried calling 3 more times as I sat in my car in the parking garage, my mind racing through possible explanations that grew increasingly unlikely with each failed attempt to reach him. Had he been laid off and not told me? Was he working somewhere else now? Or was something far more sinister happening here? I drove home in a daze, the champagne bottle rolling around in the passenger seat like a mockery of the celebration I had planned. Our apartment, which had felt like a sanctuary of newlywed happiness that morning, now seemed filled with questions and shadows. I found myself looking at Garrett's belongings with new eyes, his expensive suits hanging in our closet, his collection of business books on the shelf, the framed photo of us from our engagement party on the dresser. Everything appeared normal, but normal had just been redefined as potentially fraudulent. The sound of Garrett's key in the lock at his usual time that evening made my heart pound with a mixture of relief and apprehension. "Hey, beautiful," he called out as he entered, his voice carrying that same warm affection it always did. "How was your day off? Did you do anything special?" The normalcy of his greeting, the easy way he set down his briefcase and loosened his tie, made me question whether I had somehow imagined the entire incident at his office. But when I looked into his eyes, those blue eyes that had captivated me from our first meeting, I saw something I had never noticed before, a flicker of calculation, as if he was constantly measuring his words and reactions. "I tried to surprise you with lunch today," I said carefully, watching his face for any telltale signs of deception. "But when I went to your office, they said they'd never heard of you." The pause that followed was infinitesimal, probably unnoticeable to anyone who wasn't specifically looking for it, but it was there. A momentary freeze before his expression shifted to one of understanding and mild frustration. "Oh, sweetheart, didn't I tell you? We moved offices last week. I'm working out of the uptown location now while they renovate the downtown space." His explanation flowed smoothly, accompanied by that apologetic smile that had gotten him out of trouble countless times before. I should have mentioned it. You must have gone to the old building. But something in his tone didn't quite ring true, and for the first time in our relationship, I found myself questioning whether the man I had married was exactly who he claimed to be. That night, as Garrett slept peacefully beside me, I lay awake staring at the ceiling and replaying every conversation we'd had about his work, his background, his life before me. The details that had once seemed romantic and mysterious now felt deliberately vague and potentially constructed. He had told me he grew up in Portland, but had never offered specific details about his childhood or family. His stories about college were generic enough to apply to any university experience. Even his explanation of how he had ended up in our city was curiously light on specifics. I realized with growing unease that I knew remarkably little about the man I had promised to love for the rest of my life. The next morning, I made a decision that would change everything. Instead of going to work, I drove to the uptown location Garrett had mentioned, a gleaming high-rise that housed multiple businesses and professional firms. The directory in the lobby listed 3 real estate companies, and I systematically visited each one, armed with Garrett's photo on my phone and a story about needing to reach him urgently. The responses were identical: polite confusion, thorough checks of employee records, and the same bewildering conclusion that no one named Garrett Morrison worked for any of them. Standing in that marble lobby, surrounded by the bustle of legitimate business people heading to legitimate jobs, I felt the foundation of my marriage begin to crack. My hands trembled as I called my mother, something I probably should have done 3 months earlier when she had begged me not to marry him. "Mom," I said when she answered, my voice barely above a whisper. "I need to talk to you. Can you meet me somewhere private? It's about Garrett." The silence that followed my request was heavy with unspoken knowledge, and when Helena finally responded, her voice carried a weight of sadness that suggested she had been waiting for this call. "Come home, darling," she said softly. "It's time we had a conversation that's long overdue." The drive to my childhood home took 20 minutes, but it felt like a journey back through time to a place where my mother's word was law and her hugs could fix any problem. Helena was waiting for me on the front porch, her usually perfect appearance disheveled as if she hadn't slept, her eyes red-rimmed and filled with a pain I didn't yet understand. The sight of her looking so fragile and broken made my chest tighten with a fear that went beyond my concerns about Garrett's mysterious employment situation. Whatever she was about to tell me was going to be devastating. "I should have told you from the beginning," Helena said as she led me into the living room where I had spent countless hours as a child, dreaming about my future and the man I would someday marry. But I hoped, that maybe I was wrong, that maybe it was just an incredible coincidence. She settled into the armchair that had been my father's favorite, wrapping herself in the throw blanket as if she needed its comfort for what she was about to reveal. "When you brought him home that first night, when I saw his face, I felt like I was seeing a ghost." The way she said ghost sent chills down my spine, and I found myself gripping the arm of the sofa as I prepared for whatever bombshell she was about to drop. "Garrett Morrison," Helena continued, her voice growing stronger with each word, "was my husband before your father. We were married for 2 years, from the time I was 23 until I was 25. He left me without explanation, without warning, without even a goodbye note. One day he was there, talking about our future and planning our dream house, and the next day he was gone with half our bank account and my grandmother's jewelry." The words hit me like physical blows, each revelation more impossible than the last. My mother had been married before my father? To Garrett? The man I had been sharing a bed with for 3 months was my mother's ex-husband? The room began to spin as the implications of what she was telling me crashed over me in waves of nausea and disbelief. "That's impossible," I whispered, though even as I said it, pieces of the puzzle began clicking into place with horrifying clarity. "You've never been married to anyone but Dad." I would have known. Someone would have told me. But even as I protested, I was remembering Helena's strange behavior around Garrett, her invasive questions about his background, the way she had studied him during those Sunday dinners as if she was watching a dangerous animal that might attack at any moment. Helena reached for a photo album I had never seen before, one that had apparently been hidden away for decades. The photographs she showed me were like looking into an alternate universe where my mother was young and radiant, standing next to a man who was unmistakably Garrett Morrison, perhaps with fewer lines around his eyes and a slightly different haircut, but definitely the same person I had married. In the wedding photos, Helena wore a simple white dress and a smile of pure joy as she looked up at a man who appeared to adore her completely. There were pictures of them at what looked like a company Christmas party, vacation snapshots from a beach somewhere, casual photos around a house I didn't recognize, all evidence of a life and a relationship that had been completely erased from the family history I thought I knew. He called himself Gabriel Morrison then, Helena said, her finger tracing the edge of one particular photo where they were both laughing at something off camera. Same last name, different first name, but definitely the same man who charmed his way into your life exactly the way he charmed his way into mine. The realization that my husband was not only a fraud but potentially a serial husband who targeted women in the same family was so surreal that I couldn't immediately process it. But why? I asked, my voice cracking with the strain of trying to understand something that defied all logic and human decency. Why would he do this? Why would he marry me when he was married to you first? Why would he leave you and then come back years later for your daughter? The questions poured out of me like water from a broken dam, each one more desperate than the last. Helena's expression darkened as she closed the photo album and set it aside with trembling hands. Because, she said, her voice taking on a hardness I had never heard before, Garrett Morrison is not the man either of us thought he was. After he disappeared 28 years ago, I hired a private investigator to try to find him and get some answers. What we discovered was that Gabriel Morrison or Garrett Morrison or whatever name he's using now has been doing this for decades. He finds successful, independent women, usually with some family money or valuable assets, marries them quickly, and then disappears with whatever he can take. The words family money hit me like ice water as I realized what this meant for my own situation. The investigator found evidence of at least 4 other marriages before me, Helena continued, and we suspected there were probably more that we couldn't trace. Each time, the pattern was the same. Whirlwind romance, quick engagement, lavish wedding funded largely by the bride's family, and then a mysterious disappearance after he had access to bank accounts, credit cards, and anything else of value. She paused, studying my face as if trying to gauge how much more truth I could handle. The investigator called him a romance con artist, someone who specializes in long-term emotional manipulation for financial gain. But if that was true, why had he come back? Why risk exposing himself by targeting someone so closely connected to a previous victim? I don't understand, I said, my mind reeling as I tried to reconcile the loving husband I thought I knew with the calculating predator my mother was describing. If he's a con artist who disappears after getting what he wants, why is he still here? We've been married for 3 months. He has access to my accounts, my credit cards, everything. Why hasn't he disappeared already? Even as I asked the question, a horrible thought began forming in the back of my mind, one that I wasn't ready to voice but couldn't completely dismiss. Helena's expression grew even more troubled, if that was possible, and I knew that whatever she was about to tell me would be worse than everything that had come before. That's what terrifies me, she admitted, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. The fact that he's still here, still playing the role of devoted husband, suggests that whatever he's really after is bigger than just your personal finances. When the investigator was researching his background all those years ago, we discovered that your father's death wasn't the first time Garrett had been connected to the sudden death of a wealthy spouse. The implication of what she was suggesting hit me like a physical blow, and I found myself struggling to breathe as the room seemed to close in around me. Are you saying, I managed to gasp, that you think Garrett might have had something to do with Dad's death? The silence that followed my question was deafening, filled with possibilities too horrible to contemplate, but too frightening to ignore. Helena's tears began flowing freely now, as if saying the words out loud had broken some dam of denial she had been maintaining for years. Your father's heart attack was so sudden, so unexpected. He had just passed his annual physical with flying colors. The doctors said it was a genetic anomaly, something that couldn't have been predicted or prevented. But now, knowing that Garrett is back, knowing what he's capable of, she couldn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. "We have to go to the police," I said, reaching for my phone with hands that shook so violently I could barely hold it. "We have to tell them everything about his fake identity, his history of marriage fraud, everything, Mom. If he's dangerous, if he's done this to other people, they need to know." But even as I spoke, I realized how crazy our story would sound to law enforcement. What proof did we have beyond old photographs and the word of a private investigator from nearly 3 decades ago? What crime could we even report when no obvious crime had yet been committed? Helena grabbed my wrist gently but firmly, stopping me from dialing. "Wait," she said urgently. "Before we do anything, we need to think this through carefully. If Garrett really is what I think he is, then he's had years to perfect his methods and cover his tracks. Going to the police prematurely might just warn him that we're onto him, and then we might lose our only chance to prove what he's been doing." Her words made terrifying sense, but the thought of going home to the man who might have killed my father and was potentially planning to kill me was almost more than I could bear. "So, what do we do?" I asked, feeling more helpless and frightened than I had ever felt in my life. "We gather evidence," Helena said, her voice taking on a determination that reminded me of the strong woman who had raised me as a single mother after my father's death. "We find out what name he's really using now, where he's actually working, what his real plans are. We document everything, and then we build a case that the police can't ignore." She stood up and began pacing the room, her mind clearly racing through possibilities and strategies. "But most importantly, we don't let him know that we suspect anything. You have to go home tonight and act like nothing has changed." The thought of lying next to Garrett in our marriage bed, knowing what I now knew, made my skin crawl. But I also knew that Helena was right. If we were going to stop him, if we were going to protect not just ourselves but potentially future victims, we had to be smart about it. We had to outmanipulate the manipulator, which meant I had to become an actress in the most important performance of my life. As I drove home that evening, I practiced what I would say when Garrett asked about my day, how I would respond to his kisses and caresses, how I would pretend that our marriage was still the fairy tale I had believed it to be that morning. Every red light felt like a stay of execution. Every mile closer to home felt like a step toward danger. Garrett was cooking dinner when I arrived, humming softly as he stirred something that smelled like my favorite pasta sauce, and for a moment I almost convinced myself that this was all a terrible misunderstanding. He looked so normal, so genuinely happy to see me, that it seemed impossible he could be the monster my mother had described. "There's my beautiful wife," he said, crossing the kitchen to wrap me in his arms, and I had to use every ounce of willpower I possessed to not recoil from his touch. "How was your day?" I asked, the question loaded with new meaning now that I knew he had been lying about his job for months. "Busy but good," he replied easily, returning to the stove as if he didn't have a care in the world. "Closed a big deal today, actually. A commercial property downtown that we've been working on for weeks." The life flowed so smoothly from his lips that I realized this was probably how he had been responding to that question every day since our wedding, crafting fictional accomplishments to support his fictional career. "How about you? You seem a little tense. Everything okay?" The fact that he could read my emotional state so accurately while maintaining such an elaborate deception was both impressive and terrifying. "Just tired," I said, forcing a smile that felt like it might crack my face. It was a long day at work. We moved through our evening routine like actors in a play, discussing mundane topics over dinner, watching television on the couch with his arm around me, brushing our teeth side by side at the bathroom sink like the contented married couple we appeared to be. But every moment felt surreal and dangerous, as if I was walking through a minefield disguised as a living room. When we finally went to bed, Garrett's desire for intimacy felt like the ultimate test of my acting abilities. I lay awake for hours after he fell asleep, listening to his steady breathing and studying his face in the moonlight that filtered through our bedroom curtains. In sleep, with his features relaxed and his guard down, he looked almost innocent, Certainly not like someone capable of the systematic manipulation and potential violence my mother had described. But then I remembered the photos Helena had shown me, the evidence of his previous marriage and mysterious disappearance, and I knew that appearances could be devastatingly deceiving. What was his endgame with me? What was he waiting for? The next morning, I began my double life in earnest. After Garrett left for his fictional job, I called in sick to work and spent the day conducting my own investigation into the man I had married. Using skills I had learned in my journalism classes years earlier, I searched public records, social media profiles, and professional directories for any trace of Gabriel or Garrett Morrison. What I found was both revealing and disturbing. The name Gabriel Morrison appeared on marriage certificates and divorce records from multiple states spanning the past 30 years, but Garrett Morrison seemed to exist only in relation to me. It was as if he had created an entirely new identity, just for our relationship. I also found something else that made my blood run cold. Obituaries for several women who had been married to various iterations of the man I knew as Garrett, all of whom had died under circumstances that were ruled accidental or natural, but seemed suspiciously convenient for their grieving widower. A skiing accident in Colorado, a drowning in Florida, a heart attack in Texas. Each death had left behind a wealthy widow whose estate had been inherited by her husband before he mysteriously disappeared from that location forever. The pattern was becoming impossible to ignore, and I was apparently next in line. My phone rang just as I was printing out copies of the marriage certificates and death certificates I had found, and Garrett's name on the caller ID made me jump as if I had been caught committing a crime. "Hey, sweetheart," his voice said when I answered. Warm and affectionate as always. "I was thinking we should do something special tonight. Maybe go to that new restaurant you mentioned? My treat." The casual way he suggested spending money that I now realized probably came from previous victims rather than any legitimate employment, made me feel physically sick. "That sounds wonderful," I heard myself say, my voice sounding almost normal despite the turmoil in my chest. "Perfect. I'll make reservations for 7. There was a pause, and then his tone shifted slightly, becoming more attentive. "Are you feeling better today? You seemed a little off last night." The fact that he was monitoring my emotional state so closely suggested that my acting skills might not be as convincing as I had hoped, which added another layer of danger to an already terrifying situation. "Much better," I lied. "I think I was just coming down with something, but I'm fine now." After he hung up, I realized that our dinner date would provide the perfect opportunity to test some of the information I had uncovered and possibly gather more evidence about his true identity and intentions. But it would also mean spending an entire evening pretending to be the loving wife of a man who might be planning to murder me, which required a level of courage I wasn't sure I possessed. I called Helena to update her on what I had discovered and to ask for her advice about how to handle the evening ahead. "Be careful," she warned, her voice tight with worry. "If he suspects that you know something, he might accelerate whatever timeline he's working with." The restaurant Garrett had chosen was elegant and expensive, the kind of place that required reservations weeks in advance under normal circumstances. The fact that he had managed to secure a prime table with just a few hours' notice suggested either impressive connections or the kind of charm that could convince people to bend rules, both of which fit the profile of a sophisticated con artist. He was waiting for me at the bar when I arrived, looking devastatingly handsome in a dark suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. "You look incredible," he said, standing to kiss me in a way that felt simultaneously genuine and performed. Dinner conversation flowed as smoothly as it always did between us, but now I found myself listening with different ears, analyzing every story he told for inconsistencies and every question he asked for ulterior motives. When he mentioned a business trip he needed to take the following week, something he had never mentioned before, I felt a chill of recognition. According to the pattern I had discovered in my research, sudden business trips often preceded the mysterious disappearances that marked the end of his marriages. "Where are you going?" I asked, trying to keep my tone casually interested rather than suspicious. "Chicago," he said without hesitation, as if he had been preparing for this question. "There's a development project there that might be a good investment opportunity. I'll probably be gone for 3 or 4 days." The way he delivered this information, with just the right amount of reluctance about leaving me, was masterful in its manipulation. A week earlier, I would have been disappointed but supportive, trusting completely in his professional judgment and commitment to our future. Now I understood it was probably a lie designed to create distance before his final move. "I'll miss you," I said, and to my surprise, part of that statement was actually true. Despite everything I had learned about him, despite the growing certainty that he was dangerous and duplicitous, there was still a part of me that was attached to the man I thought I had married. The realization that I could still feel affection for someone who was probably planning to harm me was deeply disturbing and spoke to just how effective his emotional manipulation had been. When we returned home that night, Garrett seemed more amorous than usual, pulling me close the moment we walked through the door and kissing me with an intensity that felt both passionate and desperate. "I love you so much," he whispered against my ear, and the words sent shivers down my spine because I couldn't tell if they were genuine or part of his elaborate performance. As we made love that night, I found myself wondering if this was how he had behaved with my mother all those years ago, if this same tender passion had been followed by the same cruel abandonment. Or worse, if this was how he had behaved with the other wives whose obituaries I had found. The next few days passed in a surreal blur of normalcy and underlying terror. Garrett continued his routine of leaving for work each morning and returning each evening with stories about his day, while I continued my investigation during the hours he was gone. I had contacted the private investigator my mother had used decades earlier, and though he was now retired, he was willing to share his old files and help me understand the full scope of Garrett's criminal history. What he told me was even worse than I had imagined. "Your husband," he said during our clandestine meeting at a coffee shop across town, "is one of the most sophisticated romance con artists I've ever encountered. He doesn't just steal money, he steals entire lives, identities, futures. And based on the pattern we documented, he's escalated over the years from simple theft to what I believe is murder." The investigator, a weathered man named Carl who had spent 40 years tracking down cheating spouses and missing persons, spread out a collection of files that represented decades of destruction at Garrett's hands. "The death started about 15 years ago," Carl continued, pointing to a timeline he had constructed. "Before that, he was content to disappear with whatever assets he could liquidate quickly. But something changed, and he began targeting women whose deaths would be more profitable than their divorces." The implication was clear. I was married to a serial killer who specialized in making murder look like accident or natural causes, and my father might have been his first victim in our family rather than his last. The thought that Garrett might have been planning this for years, watching our family from a distance and waiting for the right opportunity to strike, was almost too horrible to contemplate. But it would explain so many things: his uncanny knowledge of our city, his familiarity with my mother's habits, his ability to charm me so completely and so quickly. "What do I do?" I asked Carl, feeling overwhelmed by the magnitude of what we were facing. "You need to get him to confess," Carl said bluntly. "Everything we have is circumstantial. The police won't be able to build a case without concrete evidence of his crimes, and by the time they gather enough proof, you'll likely be dead." His words were harsh but truthful, and I appreciated his honesty even as it terrified me. "You need to record him admitting to what he's done, or you need to catch him in the act of trying to kill you." The idea of intentionally putting myself in mortal danger to gather evidence was horrifying, but the alternative, letting Garrett continue his pattern of destruction with other innocent women, was even worse. That evening, I made a decision that would either save my life or end it. When Garrett returned from his fictional job, I was waiting for him with a bottle of wine and what I hoped looked like a seductive smile. "I thought we should have a special night together before your business trip," I said, my voice steady despite the fear coursing through my veins. "I want to celebrate how happy we've been together." The way his eyes lit up at my suggestion was both gratifying and chilling. We spent the evening reminiscing about our relationship, our first meeting, our whirlwind courtship, our beautiful wedding, while I surreptitiously recorded our conversation using an app on my phone. I steered the discussion toward his past relationships, hoping to get him to slip up and reveal something incriminating, but Garrett was too skilled to be caught so easily. His responses were carefully crafted to reveal nothing while seeming completely open and honest. "You know," I said as we finished our second bottle of wine, "sometimes I feel like I don't know very much about your life before me. You're so mysterious about your past." Garrett's smile was enigmatic as he reached across the table to take my hand. "The past doesn't matter," he said, his thumb tracing circles on my palm in a gesture that had once made me melt, but now made me want to recoil. "All that matters is our future together." But there was something in his eyes as he said it, a coldness that suggested our future might be considerably shorter than I was hoping for. "But surely there's something you can tell me," I pressed, trying to keep my tone playful rather than interrogational. "Some story from your childhood, or college, or previous relationships." "Previous relationships are exactly that, previous," Garrett said, his voice taking on a slight edge that I had never heard before. "I don't like to dwell on things that didn't work out." The finality in his tone suggested that this line of questioning was making him uncomfortable, which meant I was probably on the right track. But it also meant I was potentially walking into dangerous territory. "Of course," I said quickly, not wanting to push too hard and raise his suspicions. "I just like learning new things about you." The rest of the evening passed without incident, but I went to bed that night feeling like I was sleeping next to a bomb that could explode at any moment. Garrett's business trip was scheduled to begin in 2 days, and I had a growing suspicion that something significant was going to happen before he left. The pattern Carl had shown me suggested that Garrett's victims typically died shortly before he disappeared from their lives entirely, which meant my window of opportunity to expose him was rapidly closing. I spent the next day making preparations that I hoped would keep me alive long enough to see justice done. I sent copies of all my research to Helena, Carl, and a friend who lived out of state, with instructions to contact the police if anything happened to me. I hid recording devices in multiple locations throughout our apartment, hoping to capture something incriminating if Garrett tried to harm me. Most importantly, I developed a plan for the evening before his trip, a plan that would either prove his innocence and save my marriage, or prove his guilt and possibly save my life. The plan was simple in concept but terrifying in execution. I would confront Garrett with everything I knew and see how he reacted. That evening, I cooked his favorite meal, herb-crusted salmon with roasted vegetables, and a bottle of the expensive wine he had bought for our 3-month anniversary. The domesticity of the scene felt like the cruelest irony, setting a romantic stage for what might be the most dangerous conversation of my life. When Garrett arrived home, he seemed genuinely touched by the effort I had made, kissing me tenderly and commenting on how lucky he was to have such a thoughtful wife. If he was acting, his performance was flawless. "This is incredible," he said as we sat down to dinner, raising his wine glass in a toast. "To my beautiful wife, who makes every day feel like a celebration." The words should have made me happy, but instead they felt like a eulogy for the woman I had been before I learned the truth about him. We ate in companionable silence for several minutes, and I found myself studying his face for any signs of the monster that might be lurking beneath the surface. "Garrett," I said finally, setting down my fork with hands that trembled only slightly, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." The change in his demeanor was subtle but unmistakable, a slight stiffening of his shoulders, a barely perceptible narrowing of his eyes, as if some internal alarm system had been activated. "Of course," he said, his voice maintaining its usual warmth while his body language suggested wariness. "You can ask me anything. Have you ever been married before?" The question hung in the air between us like a live wire, charged with the potential to either defuse the situation or detonate it completely. Garrett's pause lasted only a heartbeat, but in that brief moment I saw something flicker across his features, surprise, calculation, and what might have been fear. When he spoke, his voice was carefully controlled, but I could hear the effort it was taking him to maintain his composure. "What brought this on?" he asked, deflecting rather than answering, which was itself a kind of answer. "I've been having some strange dreams lately," I lied, grateful for the acting skills I had been forced to develop over the past week. "Dreams about you, with another woman, someone who looked like she could be related to me. It's probably nothing, but it's been bothering me." The explanation was plausible enough to provide him with an easy out if he wanted to maintain his deception, but specific enough to let him know that I might be closer to the truth than he was comfortable with. Garrett reached across the table and took my hand, his touch gentle, but his grip slightly firmer than usual. "Sweetheart, I think you're letting your imagination run away with you," he said, his tone soothing but his eyes alert. "I've never been married before you. You're my first wife, my only wife, and if I have anything to say about it, you'll be my last wife." The declaration should have been romantic, but something about the way he emphasized "last wife" sent chills down my spine. "So, you've never heard the name Gabriel Morrison?" I asked, watching his face carefully for any reaction. This time, the pause was longer, and when Garrett finally responded, I could see that some internal decision had been made. His entire demeanor shifted, the mask of loving husband slipping just enough to reveal something colder and more calculating beneath. "Where did you hear that name?" he asked, his voice still calm but with an edge that hadn't been there moments before. "My mother," I said simply, deciding that the time for subtlety had passed. "She recognized you the first time I brought you home. She just needed time to remember where she had seen you before." Garrett released my hand and leaned back in his chair, studying me with an expression I had never seen before, one that combined disappointment, admiration, and something that might have been relief. "How long have you known?" he asked, and the fact that he was no longer denying anything confirmed my worst fears while simultaneously validating my investigation. "About a week," I admitted, my heart pounding as I realized we had crossed into completely uncharted territory. "I've been trying to understand why you would do this to us, why you would marry me when you were married to my mother first." "Your mother," Garrett said with a bitter laugh that contained no humor whatsoever, "was the one who got away. The only woman who ever managed to outsmart me, to disappear before I could implement my exit strategy." He stood up and began pacing around our dining room, his movements restless and predatory in a way that made me acutely aware of how alone we were in our apartment. "Do you have any idea how that felt? How it gnawed at me for 28 years, knowing that there was someone out there who had beaten me at my own game." The casual way he referred to his exit strategy made my blood run cold, confirming what Carl had told me about his pattern of leaving destruction in his wake. "So you came back for revenge?" I asked, trying to keep him talking while my mind raced through possible escape routes and survival strategies. "Not revenge," Garrett corrected, turning to look at me with eyes that seemed to be seeing me clearly for the first time since we had met. "Completion. Helena left me before I could finish what I started with her, and that failure has haunted me ever since. When I discovered she had a daughter, a beautiful, successful daughter with a substantial trust fund and a trusting nature, I saw an opportunity to complete the cycle." The matter-of-fact way he discussed my trust fund, which I had never mentioned to him, revealed just how thoroughly he had researched my background before engineering our meeting. "How long have you been planning this?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. "Years," he said with obvious pride in his own patience and planning. "I've been watching your family since your father died, waiting for the right moment to make my move. When you started working at the marketing firm downtown, when you joined that gym, when you began frequenting that coffee shop on 5th Street, none of that was coincidence. I orchestrated every aspect of our meeting, every stage of our courtship, every moment of our relationship." The revelation that our entire love story had been an elaborate trap made me feel physically sick, but it also answered the question that had been nagging at me since Helena's revelation. "Did you kill my father?" I asked, surprised by how steady my voice sounded despite the chaos in my mind. Garrett's smile was the most terrifying thing I had ever seen, triumphant and cruel and completely without warmth. "Your father's death was a masterpiece," he said, settling back into his chair as if he was preparing to regale me with a favorite story. "Completely undetectable, utterly natural-looking, and it accomplished exactly what I needed it to accomplish. One small injection of potassium chloride between his toes while he was sleeping, and Helena became a wealthy widow with a grieving daughter who would eventually need comfort and companionship." The casual way he described murdering my father, a man who had never done anything but work hard and love his family, filled me with a rage so pure and powerful that it temporarily overcame my fear. "You monster," I whispered, my hands clenching into fists as I imagined what I would do to him if I had the physical strength to overpower him. "I'm a businessman," Garrett corrected, apparently unbothered by my anger. "A very specialized businessman who provides a very specific service to lonely, wealthy women. I give them romance, passion, the fairy tale they've been dreaming of their entire lives. And in exchange, I take what they no longer need, their money, their assets, their lives if necessary." The recording device hidden in my purse was capturing every word of his confession, but I realized with growing horror that gathering evidence might be pointless if I didn't survive the evening to present it to the authorities. "So what happens now?" I asked, trying to buy time while I figured out how to get out of the situation alive. "Now," Garrett said, standing up again and walking toward the kitchen in a way that seemed deliberately casual, "we finish what we started. Your death will be tragic, but not suspicious. A young wife who accidentally took too many sleeping pills while her husband was away on a business trip. By the time your body is discovered, I'll be long gone with your life insurance payout and whatever I can liquidate from your accounts." The fact that he was discussing my murder as if it was already a foregone conclusion sent adrenaline coursing through my system, sharpening my focus and preparing my body for whatever action I might need to take. I could see him reaching into a cabinet where we kept our medications, and I realized that whatever window of opportunity one had for escape was rapidly closing. "Wait," I said, standing up quickly, but trying to appear non-threatening. "I just have one more question. If you've been doing this for decades, if you've killed multiple women, why are you telling me all of this? Why not just give me the pills and let me think it was an accident?" Garrett paused in his reaching and turned to look at me with something that might have been genuine emotion. "Because," he said slowly, "in all my years of doing this, you're the first woman I've ever actually fallen in love with. What we had together, the passion, the connection, the way you looked at me like I was the hero of your story, that was real, at least on my part. I want you to know before you die that some of what you felt was genuine." The twisted romanticism of his declaration made me realize that I was dealing with someone who was not just a criminal, but genuinely disturbed. The fact that he could claim to love me while simultaneously planning to murder me revealed a level of psychological damage that no rational argument could penetrate. I had to accept that there would be no reasoning with him, no appealing to his better nature, because he simply didn't have one, which meant my only option was to fight. "I understand," I said, moving slowly toward where my purse sat on the kitchen counter, trying to look resigned rather than desperate. "I'm glad it was real for you, too. But can I ask for one last favor? Can I call my mother and tell her goodbye? She deserves to hear from me one last time." Garrett considered my request with the air of someone who is feeling magnanimous in victory. "I suppose that would be a nice touch," he said finally. "It will add to the authenticity of your final hours. A loving daughter calling to check on her mother before accidentally overdosing. But make it brief, and remember that I'll be listening to every word." I nodded gratefully and reached for my phone, but instead of calling Helena, I activated the emergency app that would automatically dial 911 and broadcast our conversation to the operator. Then I did something that surprised both of us. I lunged for the kitchen drawer where we kept our knives. What followed was a struggle that lasted only minutes but felt like hours, a desperate physical battle between a trained killer and a woman fighting for her life. Garrett was stronger and more experienced, but I had the advantage of desperation and the element of surprise. We crashed into furniture, shattered dishes, and screamed threats and pleas at each other while sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer with each passing second. By the time the police broke down our door, I was bleeding from multiple cuts, and Garrett was unconscious on our kitchen floor, felled by a cast-iron skillet that had become my unlikely weapon of salvation. The aftermath was a blur of ambulances, interrogations, and legal proceedings that would eventually see Garrett Morrison, whose real name turned out to be Gabriel Matthew Thornton, convicted of multiple counts of murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The recording I had made of his confession, combined with the evidence Carl and I had gathered, led to the reopening of numerous cold cases across multiple states and brought justice for families who had been grieving for decades without answers. But justice, I discovered, was a cold comfort when it came to rebuilding a life that had been shattered by betrayal and deception. The months following Garrett's arrest were the darkest of my life, filled with therapy sessions, legal depositions, and the slow, painful process of learning to trust my own judgment again. Helena and I grew closer than we had ever been, bonded by our shared experience of surviving the same predator and united in our determination to help other victims of romance fraud. We started a foundation in my father's memory that provided resources and support for families affected by similar crimes. Yet even now, 2 years later, I find myself questioning every interaction, analyzing every relationship for signs of manipulation or deception. The man I thought I had married never actually existed. He was a carefully constructed fiction designed to exploit my vulnerabilities and steal my life. The love I thought we shared was real only on my side, a one-way emotional transaction that left me feeling foolish and used. Learning to forgive myself for being deceived has been harder than learning to forgive Garrett for deceiving me, because self-forgiveness requires accepting that even intelligent, cautious people can be victims of sophisticated manipulation. But perhaps the most disturbing revelation of all came during the trial, when forensic accountants discovered that Garrett had been living off the proceeds of his crimes for so long that he had accumulated a fortune worth millions of dollars. Money stolen from dozens of women over 30 years, carefully invested and managed to create a lifestyle of luxury funded by grief and destruction. The knowledge that my father's death had been part of a larger business plan, that our family's tragedy was just one line item in a psychopath's financial portfolio, was almost harder to bear than the personal betrayal. The question that haunts me now as I try to rebuild my life and learn to trust again is how many other Gabriel Thorntons are out there? How many other charming, handsome men are systematically targeting vulnerable women, using romance as a weapon and love as a tool for destruction? The investigative work I've done since the trial has revealed a disturbing truth. Romance fraud is far more common than most people realize, and the perpetrators are often so skilled that even law enforcement struggles to identify and prosecute them. Which brings me to why I'm telling this story now, 2 years after it began, and with so many questions still unanswered. Last week, I received a letter in the mail, no return address, postmarked from a city I've never visited, written in handwriting that made my blood run cold with recognition. Inside was a single photograph, a picture of me leaving my apartment building, taken recently enough that I was wearing a dress I had bought just last month. On the back, written in the same careful handwriting, were 4 words that have kept me awake every night since. The cycle isn't over. At first, I thought it might be some kind of sick joke or a threat from one of Garrett's admirers. Apparently, convicted killers receive love letters from disturbed individuals who romanticize their crimes. But when I showed the letter to Carl, now working as a private security consultant, his face went pale in a way that told me this was something far more serious than fan mail. "Clarissa," he said, studying the photograph with a magnifying glass, "I think Gabriel had a partner. Someone who's been watching you, waiting to see what happened to him, and now that partner knows you're the one who brought him down. The possibility that there might be another predator out there, someone who knew intimate details about Garrett's methods and might be seeking revenge for his imprisonment, was terrifying enough. But what made it worse was the growing realization that the photograph had been taken from an angle that suggested the photographer had been inside my building, possibly even inside my apartment. Someone had been close enough to touch me, to harm me, and I had never known they were there. Which means that as I sit here now, typing this story in what I hope is the safety of my new apartment in a city far from where any of this began, I have no idea if I'm truly safe or simply waiting for the next chapter of a nightmare that may never end. The man I married turned out to be my mother's ex-husband and a serial killer who had been planning my death for years. But now it seems that story, as incredible and horrifying as it was, might have been just the beginning of something even darker. And somewhere out there, someone is watching, waiting, and planning the next move in a game I don't understand but can't escape. The fairy tale I thought I was living turned out to be a horror story with no clear ending, and I'm beginning to suspect that the most terrifying chapter hasn't been written yet.